This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 858 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Did you miss me? I had a little time to recharge, to get my data in order for the offseason. And I'm very excited that it's the offseason. Not because I dislike the weekly grind of the regular season. Obviously, that's the most important part of the fantasy football calendar. But during the winter and the spring months, I'm able to do deep dives. I'm able to study topics that I just can't get to during the regular season. And I'm able to do a little bit of reflecting. I say it all the time, but during the fantasy season, I don't do a whole lot of analysis on why I was right or wrong about a certain preseason take, or even an in-season take. I just don't really see the need to do that while the season's still going. My goal is to give you advice to keep your fantasy teams winning. Going through W's and L's doesn't achieve that goal. Instead, I just wait until the season's over. That way I can thoughtfully look back at some of my preseason takes or even my in-season takes, and I can evaluate them. And I want to evaluate my approach to things because I want to be better. It's really that simple. So with that in mind, today's episode, it's the one where I make fun of myself. I walk through some of my worst takes from the season. But I'm not just stopping at, hey, look at me, I'm a moron. I want to know how big of a moron I actually was. Did I get a little unlucky? Or was the wrong stance on a player or situation completely avoidable? And if it was avoidable, how can I and you make sure the mistake doesn't happen again? Next week, then I'll do the opposite and go through some of my biggest hits. That's always an easier show to do because I'm only human. I want to be right. But being wrong is okay. It's not a bad thing to be wrong. We're not going to get everything right in fantasy football. Being wrong can be good. It's the best way to learn and to grow. And I've definitely done a lot of that through the years because of this episode. Okay, I'll stop rambling. But before I get into the things that didn't go my way in 2023, I wanted to let you know that the Late Round Prospect Guide, the 2024 version, it's officially available for pre-order. This year's guide, it's going to be different. Not only are the prospect models improved with some new approaches, but you'll get tight end scores this year as well. Yes, the tight end model is being published. You can check it all out by heading to lateround.com. Now let's take a look at the dumb things that I did in 2023. I think my biggest miss of the season was with Mike Evans. If you look back at last year's late round draft guide, you'll notice that Evans wasn't written up as a player to avoid. It was Chris Godwin instead. And that was because Godwin had the higher ADP versus Mike Evans. Godwin also had never really been an alpha receiver in the NFL when it came to target share. I was worried about him on that front. That actually ended up being an okay enough call. Godwin played slightly below average draft position expectation. And for the record, I'll be referencing that throughout today's show. So let me explain what I mean when I say ADP expectation. Every player in a fantasy draft has some sort of ADP, right? Using historical numbers, we can figure out the number of points per game that we'd expect a player to score at that ADP. So Godwin in 2023, he had an ADP of about 54 according to my fantasy league's redraft data. At that ADP, he'd be expected to score 12.6 PPR points per game. That's based on history. But he scored 12.3 points per game. So he was below expectation, albeit slightly. Mike Evans definitely was not. Evans played 4.6 PPR points per game above ADP expectation. That was his best season versus expectation since his rookie year. He was a top 8 value at wide receiver this year, according to my numbers. So yeah, I'm an idiot for not being higher on him. I was about 6 spots lower in wide receiver rank with Mike Evans versus consensus. Now, a few things went wrong here, and they're definitely things that I can fix in the future. Number one, I did what I tell people not to do, and that's draft off of consensus assumptions. The general assumption with this Tampa Bay offense was that the passing attack would take a serious step back. And to be fair, there were reasons to believe that they were going to throw the ball less and also run for more touchdowns this year than they did in 2022. I wrote about that in the team regression section of the draft guide. And guess what? Those two things happened. Year over year, Tampa Bay's passing volume, their pass attempts, dropped by almost 200. The team's receiving yards fell by over 700. Their percentage of touchdowns that came through the air in 2022 was 84%. In 2023, that number was 78%. The flaw in my analysis was that I looked too much at volume and not enough at what was going on with Tampa Bay at an even higher level last season, in 2022 that is. And that's despite doing projections. I just didn't focus on it for whatever reason. Yes, they were losing Tom Brady, but Tampa Bay only scored 31 offensive touchdowns in 2022. Since 2011, NFL teams have been averaging about 2.4 touchdowns per game offensively. In 2022, Tampa Bay was at 1.8. Only 4 teams were worse. So yes, the volume wasn't the same for this Bucs passing attack, but the Bucs offense realistically was projected to be better offensively from a scoring perspective. Now, the other piece of this is that I didn't put enough stock into the potential for Mike Evans to see a higher target share in 2023 versus 2022. In 2022, his target share per game was actually under 20%. So realistically, he could have combated this lower passing volume in the Bucs offense by seeing a higher target share. And that's exactly what happened. His target share rose by almost 5 percentage points. And then obviously there's the touchdowns. He did outperform in the touchdown column this year by a couple of scores, but he was used in a way where his expected total was still very, very high. And it's Mike Evans. Why wouldn't that be the case? So my read on the Tampa Bay offense being more run heavy, spot on. That happened. The problem is that I made the amateur mistake of just following along with consensus and thinking that Baker Mayfield would be an obvious downgrade, even though Tom Brady wasn't very good in 2022 for this Bucs offense. And for the record, that's why I don't see this as a similar situation as what we saw in 2022 with the Seattle Seahawks. Geno Smith in 2022 was better than Baker Mayfield in 2023. Let's get that out of the way. When people made that comparison this past offseason and they compared Evans and Godwin to Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, I wasn't going to project Baker Mayfield to have the best adjusted completion percentage in football. But when Geno took over that team, he was taking over a team that was actually quite good in touchdowns per game the year prior. They saw a decrease in touchdowns per game that year. That wasn't the case for the Bucs. The Bucs starting point was much lower, if that makes sense. And look, Evans himself played way better than I expected too. There's no doubt. His yards per route run was significantly higher than what he'd been seeing with Tom Brady. And obviously his touchdown production was there too, which is crazy for a 30-year-old wideout. But he's a Hall of Famer, and he showed us why in 2023. Next time I'm looking at a situation like this, I need to stress every part of the offense year over year and not just the volume side. Now, to be honest, Mike Evans wasn't a player that people would troll me for. Drake London, on the other hand, that story is a little different. I think people came at me for my Drake London takes more than any other player this year. And look, those trolls, those people who want to get under my skin, they were right. I was wrong. Drake London was not very good this year in fantasy football. I thought London was a good pick this year for a few reasons. Number one, he's good at the game. His year 2 model score was very, very strong, and players in his tier usually work out well. Not only that, but historical average draft position data, it suggests that a player like London would outperform ADP. Players with his background, his rookie season peripherals, his draft slot, good results usually happened. Basically, I drafted Drake London because I thought he was a very good wide receiver. And I also played into the thing that I just talked about with Mike Evans. London was being pushed down in ADP because of his situation. We all know that. The Falcons were coming off a season where they were one of the most run-heavy teams in modern NFL history. And they had no answer at quarterback. If you rewind the tape, you'd hear me recognize all of that. Of course there was risk with Drake London. There was Desmond Ridder. There was Arthur Smith. It had a shot to go south. My point in drafting London, I'm going to lump Christian Watson in here as well. But my point with him was that you should feel free to take shots on potentially very talented players in that range of your draft. They went in round 4 and into round 5 in a lot of leagues this past year. If you were loading up on wide receivers early, then it didn't kill your team if those guys busted. There were a lot of seemingly good wideout selections immediately after those guys too, that you could get in the later rounds. So the Drake London thing, the Christian Watson thing, yeah, give me the L on the result. But the way I approached those players, and I talked about it on the show, the way I approached it was that they were guys that you could make up for if they didn't live up to their potential. With Drake London, I just thought he was a stud player. I still think he's a very, very good wide receiver. With Christian Watson, he just had crazy, crazy upside, and I'm more than willing to invest in that kind of upside in redraft. But I'll save some of the Watson talk for a mailbag episode. Where I do think I was right with London was with Atlanta's team philosophy. The consensus assumption was that Atlanta was going to be this ultra run-heavy team once again. And while I did see them being as a run-heavy team this year, they were bound to regress there. And they did. They actually threw the ball 115 more times year over year. They were still a run-heavy team, don't get me wrong. They just weren't historically run-heavy like they were in 2022. Now, on the volume front, where I was wrong with London was making the assumption that he could maintain a 28% target share year over year. He did that as a rookie, which played into why he was such an attractive year 2 option. But his target share in 2023 was 23% per game. That led to fewer overall targets per game, despite the Falcons being more pass heavy. If I'm being honest though, you guys, I don't think I'd necessarily change my approach here. I think versus consensus, I'd be higher on a player like London in his profile. And I think with that process, I'd win more often than not. Where I think my process will change is just how aggressively I go after a profile like this, where the team situation could very clearly go south. Some may disagree, but I'm still a believer that London's a good football player. Since we're talking about the Falcons, let's just shift our focus to Bijan Robinson. I was okay with drafting him in round 1 this year, and he underperformed on a points per game basis by about 3 PPR points. He averaged 14.5 PPR points per game, and that includes the ridiculousness of that sickness game. But he didn't live up to expectation. I think people are going to go back and look at this season and say that it was insane that a rookie running back who'd never done anything in the NFL was getting drafted that early in redraft. But I think that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at this. There's a lot more to it. And honestly, we've had 4 rookie running backs with first-round ADP since 2011. 2 of those 4 ended up exceeding expectation by a huge number. Those 2 were Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott. The 2 who didn't, one was Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He underperformed expectation by about 4 points per game, and then Bijan Robinson by about 3 points per game. As I said all offseason, Bijan Robinson was much closer to a Saquon Barkley or an Ezekiel Elliott type prospect than a Clyde Edwards-Helaire one. I mean, you can extend this rookie running back analysis into round 2 also. In round 2, you add Najee Harris to the mix. When he was a rookie, he outperformed expectation by 2.6 PPR points per game. He was great. Okay, let's look at round 3 of a 12-team league. Now you've added Jahmyr Gibbs, Josh Jacobs, Leonard Fournette, Trent Richardson, and Dalvin Cook when they were first-year players. Guess what? Every single one of those players exceeded expectation on a points-per-game basis. Dalvin Cook only played 4 games, though, because he was hurt. I just want to throw that out there. But guys, the Bijan Robinson stuff has nothing to do with the fact that he was a rookie. If anything, rookies are amazing as early round picks. It had to do with usage. We've seen 17 running backs get drafted in round 1 since 2011 while playing 10 or more games as rookies. So Travis Etienne, for example, not part of this subset. Of those 17, Robinson's running back rush share per game as a rookie ranked 13th. Now, the 4 running backs who were ranked behind him in running back rush share per game, they were mostly pass-catching backs. They didn't profile to be the same kind of player that Bijan Robinson profiled to be in the NFL. Those guys were Jahmyr Gibbs, Christian McCaffrey, Rashad Penny, and David Wilson. And Wilson and Penny didn't have the same type of draft capital that Robinson had. I looked back at my projections from before the season started, and I had Robinson at a 63% running back rush share per game rate. He finished the season with a 47.5% one. And then on top of that crappy ground game usage, Robinson wasn't used as the team's primary goal line back until halfway through the season. That turning point is when we saw his points per game rise by 4 points. The second half of the season was more of what I expected from Bijan Robinson, and he would have outperformed ADP expectation had he maintained that second half pace throughout the year. So I was definitely wrong on the results front with Bijan Robinson, but I'm not mad at this process at all. Arthur Smith was more unpredictable than I thought that he'd be. This wasn't a rookie running back thing. If you hear someone say that, they're wrong, objectively. It was a misuse of resources thing. And that's why Arthur Smith doesn't have a job with the Falcons anymore. I wasn't out here saying that you have to draft Patrick Mahomes this year. I did think in smaller leagues, getting an elite quarterback made sense. That being Mahomes, Allen, and Jalen Hurts. But Mahomes didn't work out. The reason I'm bringing up Mahomes on today's show is because early in the season, you might remember this, I did call him a buy candidate. And that was largely based on two things. Number one being upcoming schedule, and number two, he's Patrick Mahomes. And that was clearly wrong. I went back and read the blurb that I wrote about Mahomes when I called him a buy candidate after week 4, just to remember the logic behind it. And look, I'll be honest, this is not easy to do on a podcast that's going to be listened to by a lot of people. But I'm going to read part of that blurb because it highlights why I was wrong. It says, through 4 weeks, Patrick Mahomes, the Patrick Mahomes, is the QB8 in points per game. He's averaging fewer than 20 standard fantasy points per contest when he's been above that mark during every year as starter. That alone tells you that this probably won't keep up, that he's likely going to be better. Now, after I wrote that, I got into the Chiefs' schedule and how it was pretty easy moving forward. All of that was true, and I do think that history can teach us a lot about the future. But the problem here is that I wasn't looking enough into what Mahomes had done thus far through the first 4 weeks of the season. Even if I wanted to use the strength of schedule argument, I was failing to recognize what he had faced up until that point in time. And I adjust for that kind of thing when I'm doing my analysis. I just saw it as a pretty easy transaction. Mahomes, as we know, didn't get better. And that was an in-season miss by me. I like Tony Pollard this year. And according to ADP expectation, he underperformed by a little over 2 PPR points per game. Not great. I don't really regret my process on Pollard, though, to be honest. Pollard played a little over his head in 2022, there's no doubt. But he had been an efficient runner throughout his entire career. In fact, and this is something that I wrote about in the draft guide, Pollard entering the season had seen runs of 10 plus yards on at least 13% of his rushes in 3 of 4 NFL seasons. We just don't see that type of efficiency. Now, was that due to having fresh legs and never carrying some massive workload? I mean, maybe there's something there. But when Ezekiel Elliott had missed time, Pollard was not just an RB1 in fantasy. He wasn't just like a top 12 back. He was the RB1 in fantasy. When you look at his production in that small sample without Zeke, Tony Pollard was the RB1. I'm talking Christian McCaffrey-like numbers. Unfortunately, Pollard just wasn't as good this year, period. He saw his rate of gaining 10 plus yards cut in half. More importantly, and this is what absolutely destroyed his fantasy value, he scored 3 goal line touchdowns. 3. According to Pro Football Focus's expected touchdowns model, Pollard underperformed the touchdown column this year by nearly 8 touchdowns. Let's just do some quick math. 8 touchdowns equates to 48 fantasy points. That's over 2.8 fantasy points per game. Meaning had he hit expectation in the touchdown column, Pollard would have actually outperformed expectation in 2023. And I get it, he didn't get there. That's why this is an L. That's why I was wrong. But if you were to tell me that Tony Pollard, a player who was unbelievably efficient and strong as a runner across his first 4 years in the league, if you would have told me at the beginning of the season that he'd see over 250 rush attempts and have 17 goal line rushes and not exceed expectation, I would have been surprised. Guys, Tony Pollard became just the second running back since 2011 to have more than 15 goal line rushes and score 3 or fewer touchdowns on them. The only other player was oddly Nick Chubb in 2019. At the end of the day, I'm trying to project volume first and foremost, and Pollard got that in a really good offense. He took a step back as a player for sure, and maybe that was due to him finally being a consistent bell cow back. Maybe he couldn't handle that. Maybe it was him coming off an injury. Maybe, and I think this has something to do with it, it was how Dallas used him. But that was just part of the story. An even bigger part was just him playing historically bad when it mattered most for fantasy managers. And that's admittedly not something that I'm going to ever project. I'm not going to project someone to score 3 goal line touchdowns on 15 plus goal line rushes. So taking a step back, I think this is a case where I might be slightly more hesitant when a player is stepping into a bigger role. I think that's a big learning for me, for sure. But I don't want to overstate that. Because it doesn't always work out this way. Look at Austin Eckler when he got more work. I think process-wise, I'd probably make the choice to draft a player like Tony Pollard once again. That's just me being honest about the evaluation. And I play fantasy football a little bit more aggressively than others. But I do think that I'd make that choice once again. Now, I've got one more thing for you. I could go on and on about the things that I missed this year, because there are tons of examples. I'm just trying to get the bigger stuff here and the most intriguing stuff for all of us to learn something. One of the things that I've talked about on the show through the years is how rookie wide receivers tend to be undervalued in redraft. The hit rates for middle round rookie wide receivers in particular, they're really strong. And at the very least, especially with late round ones, you get great production from them during the second half of the season versus the first. Which makes sense because they have to get acclimated to the game. Now this season, I called out all 4 rookie wideouts as targets who were being drafted in those middle to later rounds. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, and Quentin Johnston. The first rounders in the real NFL draft last year. And the reason I want to talk about this in particular is because it's been something that multiple readers and listeners have come to me about. They saw this as bad advice. And look, in total, the 4 of those players were bad picks. That's largely because Quentin Johnston is not nearly as good as his draft slot indicated. And Jackson Smith-Njigba didn't have a big role in Seattle's offense. QJ underperformed his draft slot by 4.5 PPR points per game. JSN was about 2 points per game under expectation. But 2 of those 4 players did outperform expectation. Addison was 1.9 points above expectation, Zay Flowers 2.1. But this is a show about the misses, so let's focus on those L's. Let's focus on JSN and Quentin Johnston. I thought that JSN was the best wide receiver prospect in the 2023 class. And generally speaking, I'm going to target talent in fantasy football, both in dynasty and redraft. On top of that, trends told us that when a team has 3 pass catchers being drafted as early as Seattle's pass catchers were, that's a sign that the offense is going to perform well in that season. I laid all of that information out on the podcast and in the draft guide. And while Seattle's offense, it took a step back in 2023. They scored 2 touchdowns per game versus 2.5 the year prior. They averaged fewer yards per play. They ran fewer plays overall too. That had some effect on Jackson Smith-Njigba. But so did the fact that part of the upside with JSN was that he not only had 1 injury-related path to upside, but he had 2. If one of DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett got hurt, then JSN would have seen a big boost in production. Some may say that it's silly to embed that into analysis to determine if a pick is good or not. I totally disagree. It's part of the game. You're not drafting solely because of that. You're not drafting JSN, or you didn't this past season, solely because he had injury upside. But you are drafting knowing that there's a higher chance that an injury can help a player like JSN versus another wide receiver. George Pickens gets a boost if Deontay Johnson goes down. But there's only 1 wide receiver in that Pittsburgh offense who could really boost up George Pickens' numbers with an injury. With JSN, there's 2 of them. It just so happened that those 2 guys missed a combined 1 game in 2023. And guess what? In that game, JSN had a season-high 16.3 PPR points scored, and he had a 29% target share. So not only could JSN just be good, but there was that injury upside. And I do think there were platforms out there where JSN ended up getting juiced up a little bit too much. And maybe I factored in that injury upside thing a little bit too much too. But at the same time, as a middle round pick, I'm shooting for upside. And I do think that upside was present with JSN. Like, think of it this way. On the season, JSN played about 2 points below expectation on a points per game basis. That was with arguably the worst fantasy circumstances that he could have walked into. Because again, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, they stayed relatively healthy all year. There weren't injuries. Now, he wasn't usable in most 10 or 12 team leagues, but he still got by in deeper formats, despite those injuries not even hitting. Now, I think this goes back to some of the other things that I talked about on today's show. In the future, if a wide receiver, even a rookie wide receiver, has 2 pretty legit options alongside him, I'm probably not going to be as aggressive moving forward. But if his ADP falls to a reasonable spot, and if I believe in the talent, similar to JSN this year on some platforms, I'll feel fine taking him. Now, Quentin Johnston was an L as well on the results side of things. And unlike Jackson Smith and Jigba, Johnston had all the opportunity in the world, and he just fell flat on his face. I had talked a lot about Johnston being a volatile prospect during draft season last year, like during prospect season. And he's looking like he's going to hit the lower end of his range of outcomes. But I've said this before. When we're talking about the 9th, the 10th round for a wide receiver in redraft, that's not really that big of an investment. It'd be different if I was screaming for you to buy QJ in Dynasty. That's a legit investment. You're not losing your fantasy league if you miss your 9th round selection. You'd ideally want him to hit, of course. But I think Johnston, despite the result, was actually still a reasonable redraft selection, like from a process standpoint. And that's coming from someone who questioned him as a prospect and wrote about that. At the end of the day, we were talking about a first-round wide receiver who was attached to Justin Herbert and an offense with aged wideouts. It's hard to see that today, knowing that he's likely going to bust. I understand that. I'm just trying to be objective with this process and how things ended up. I do think that it was rational to take that shot in some leagues. Now, a lot of people are going to look back at this season and think that rookies aren't reasonable selections in redraft. And yeah, there was some volatility with this rookie group this year. Players like Tank Dell, Puka Nacua, Jaden Reed, they emerged. Guys like JSN and Quentin Johnston, they didn't come through, despite having better draft capital. But I think it's very, very easy in a case like this to take a singular data point, Quentin Johnston, for instance, and make sweeping statements about a class of players. At the end of the day, we have loads of data pointing to younger players being great season-long picks. I'm not going to change my opinion because a volatile first-round wide receiver didn't come through or because a talented first-round wide receiver was buried on his depth chart. So be prepared for me to still tout rookie wide receivers. This season didn't change that at all. Now, like I said, there are plenty of things that I didn't cover on this show that I could have. I had Deebo Samuel as a sell at the complete wrong time. I was cool with buying into Pittsburgh's passing attack this year. Trust me, guys, I know there's more that I got wrong. I just wanted to focus on some things that seemed to really capture the 2023 season for me, that gave us a wide range of examples. I hope the exercise helped you as much as it helped me. Next week, we'll do the opposite. We'll look at the things that went right and talk through whether those things were actually predictable or if I just got lucky. But for now, that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. This Friday, I'll have a mailbag episode for you, so stay tuned for that. I'll talk to you then.